body language really falls under the bigger banner of nonverbal communication. And the reason why it's so important is because 60 to 80% of what we communicate is actually through nonverbal communication. And the ability to be able to read what other people's body language is saying is to basically be able to know what people are thinking and feeling no matter what they're saying. But of course, not only do we need to be able to read people's body language, we also need to be able to use the right body language ourselves, because people are unconsciously or subconsciously picking up what we're putting down as well with our body language. But I want to start with the 3 biggest mistakes that people make when it comes to reading body language, because of course what we read or perceive in other people is going to influence the kind of body language or the kind of thoughts and feelings we have and what we communicate. So because we're talking about nonverbal communication, the acronym that I've created is SH, almost like keep quiet because it's nonverbal, SSH. The first S stands for sets, S-E-T-S, sets. We need to look for a set of gestures or cues or signals or expressions that communicate the same thing. Generally, we want to look for at least a set of 3 that communicate the same thing. Normally, people have learned what we call universal cues, which is to say that if somebody, for example, if somebody is not keeping eye contact, then they're lying to you. Well, really, we don't know because we need to look for other things in the set that could communicate that. Maybe they just have a low self-esteem and they're not good with eye contact with anyone. And so we need to always have a set of gestures that communicate the same thing. The second S in the acronym of SH is for situation, which is really just looking at the context that could be influencing the body language that they're using. So, for example, here's another mistake that people make. They think to themselves, oh, well, if somebody's sitting with their arms crossed like this, it means that they're closed off. Well, it could mean that they're closed off, but it could also mean that it's cold. You know, and especially in this world where we're doing a lot of video conferencing, you can't really feel the temperature in someone else's room. But of course, if we're sitting in a boardroom, you might want to become more mindful of what the temperature is. It could just mean, or maybe they're just really comfortable. Sometimes it is a comfortable gesture. So we need to look always at what the situation is. So that could be the context, maybe the environment, but it could also mean what is the context of the conversation that we're having as well. So that is sets and situation, and the final letter is H for harmony. Now we know that even if you're not good at music, you can tell if you're listening to people trying to harmonize or instruments trying to harmonize in a song, if one of them is off, it just doesn't sound right. It doesn't feel right. You might know nothing about music, but you can pick up that there's just something wrong. And so I don't know if you've ever had the situation where you're interacting with someone and you just can't put your finger on it, but something feels wrong. It's just something's not right, and you're not sure, do you believe them? Are they telling the truth? And so typically that H stands for harmony, right? Is what someone is saying verbally and what they're saying non-verbally in harmony, or is it congruent? Are they communicating the same thing? And typically speaking, when we're communicating with others, we want to make sure that our verbal and non-verbal is in harmony. This is why top business people, politicians, they go through a lot of coaching, because they understand that if they're addressing a group of people, they're going to make sure that everybody can trust what it is that they're saying, that people feel good, that they don't feel like something's off with the messaging. And so if you are talking to somebody and you feel like what they're saying verbally and non-verbally is not in harmony, generally speaking, the better, more accurate source of information would be their non-verbal communication, because it's very easy to control what we're saying verbally. But people don't realize that they're leaking cues and clues about what they're thinking and feeling through their non-verbal communication. So that is sets, situation, and harmony. And if you follow those 3 fundamentals, it'll greatly increase your ability to know what people are thinking and feeling regardless of what they're saying. So during lockdown, during this time of COVID, we have realized that a lot of stuff has moved online. Of course, we're still seeing people face to face, but what body language do we not only read in others, but do we use ourselves to be able to still create that connection with people, to be able to communicate effectively, and to be able to develop relationships? So I'm going to give you a couple of tips here that you can use instantly to be able to increase your ability to read and use body language. The first that I want to share with you is how we use our hands. Now, if you're on a video conference and if you're meeting people face to face, try and make sure that your hands are visible. So if you're meeting people face to face, make sure that they're not under the table on your legs. And similarly, if you're on a video conference, you want to make sure that you're not just getting from your shoulders up or you got some strange angle. We know that some people like to put the camera so far down, we're basically looking up, people's noses. You want to make sure that you got a nice straight a camera angle and that you can actually have your arms and hands involved. And the reason why is this. I'm going to say the same thing to you in a couple of different ways, and I want to see how you respond. But before I do this to you, I want you to try a quick experiment. Now, this will require you to actually say something out loud and for you to use your hands at the same time, and people around you will think that you are totally crazy speaking to a video playing on the screen. But just try this out and see for yourself. On the count of 3, I want you to say the following, and I want you to say this with as much meaning and charisma as you can. I want you to say, I promise it wasn't me. So that's exactly what you do. You just say, Gilan, I promise it wasn't me. And I want you to see what is the gesture that you use naturally with your hands. What do you do with your hands when you say that? So here we go, on 3. 1, 2, 3. Gilan, I promise it wasn't me. All right, now listen. Whether you did it or not, what you would probably find is that if you had to do this with other people, all right, maybe you're not in a situation where you can do it, but get other people to do it to you, there are 2 common gestures that people use. So in my talks around the world, no matter what culture or country people are in, 95+% of people either say, Gilan, I promise it wasn't me, notice my hands like this, or they say, Gilan, I promise it wasn't me. Now, in both of these situations, you can see that my palms are being revealed to you. And so we're wired as humans that if we're being open and honest with people, it's far more comfortable and natural for us to reveal our palms than for us to put them away. In fact, if you're speaking to somebody and they're saying, really, you should believe me, and they're hiding their hands, that could be a clue that could be part of a set of gestures that could indicate that maybe they're not being totally truthful. So if you want to develop a sense of rapport with people over video conference or live, or you want to develop some kind of trust, when you're talking to people, you want to be very conscious of what you're doing with your palms. So see how this feels. If I say to you, I want you to help the team on Monday. How did that feel? Could have been neutral, right? But how does it feel if I say this in exactly the same way, but just with one small change with how I use my hands? I want you to help with the team on Monday. Now, when I do this to a live audience, most people, almost 100% of people will say that when my palms are up, that feels like less of a command. And so people are more likely to cooperate when your palms are up. And, knowing what not to do is also really good. So, palms down is one thing, but also pointing your finger like this, if you're pointing to people, especially if you're on a video conference, people's fingers in your face, that could actually cause a lot of disconnect. So the first tip is to use your palms up. The second thing, also with the hands that you want to be conscious of, is what are other people doing with their hands? If you're speaking to somebody and they either disagree with what you say, they've got an opinion, and they don't like what you're saying, what you'll find is that people will start to cover their mouth, either with like a shh kind of gesture like this, or sometimes with their whole hand. Also, if somebody wants to speak, but let's say you're talking for too long, they'll start to do that as well. So let's say, for example, you're in a meeting on video conference, there's lots of different people, you see them all over the screen. And as you're speaking, people start covering their mouth. It might be a good opportunity to then say to that person who's covering their mouth, hey, what do you think about this? Because that could indicate that either they disagree or that they want to say something, but they just don't want to interrupt you, so they're holding themselves back from speaking. So that's a lot to do with the hands. And the last thing, which is just a really quick tip, is eye contact. We know that when we're speaking to somebody live, you want to maintain good eye contact. And when it comes to video conferences, a lot of the time, people will speak the entire time like this. Now, you can tell the difference between me speaking to you like this or me actually looking at you. So what would be a good idea is that when you're actually speaking to people, to just make sure that you're also looking into the camera so that they feel like you have got eye contact, especially if you're saying something really impactful or something that you really want to create a connection. The rest of the time you can judge between both so that you're obviously able to read their body language as well while you're speaking. So those are a few tips that you can use to not only influence people through your body language, but also to be able to read what they're thinking and feeling so that you know how to respond in the most influential way. All right, so we've spoken a lot about the hands. We've spoken about the palms, that if we reveal our palms to people, it immediately communicates openness, honesty. We can develop that rapport with each other. But something that a lot of us experience as we start venturing out of our homes and we're meeting people in real life is, what do we do when we actually meet somebody? Now, I don't know if you're aware that people form 90% of their opinion about you in the first 4 minutes of meeting you. And so it's easier to be able to make a good first impression than it is to try and now repair a poor first impression. So what we want to do is be very conscious about how we greet people, because that's going to communicate a lot. So there's two things. The one is, when it comes to handshakes, not everyone is actually shaking hands. And so often we find that there's kind of this weird, and one person's, it's like almost ching chong cha that's happening and no handshakes. So one of the things that we can do is just be clear in your mind about whether you are shaking hands or fist pumping. We should all be fist pumping, right? In terms of safety. You want to make sure that your intentions are very, very clear ahead of time. And so if you approach somebody before you're at the distance that you would actually be, say, shaking hands or fist pumping, I'm just including both for now, just so that no matter when you're reading this, if handshakes are back, or people are doing both, it's still relevant. But as you're approaching somebody, you want to make sure that you're already indicating what you're going to do. So as you're walking up to somebody, if you're putting your hands out like this, they know that your intention is to shake hands, and that's very clear. Right now, at the time of recording this, you'll probably walk up to somebody and have your fist out ready to pump, so that they know that that's what's going to happen as well. And people gravitate towards others who have certainty. And so when you're approaching somebody and they feel like you're certain, that gives them certainty, and it just immediately makes them feel a lot safer, which is great for building rapport. Safer in the sense that they know where they are with you, they know what's expected. And if you do find that there's a time where people are doing both and there's that kind of weird interaction, just with confidence, say to somebody, let's do that properly, and then just go ahead and do a proper fist pump. A lot of people feel like embarrassed that they're not sure what to do, and then in terms of first impressions, you're losing that sense of certainty. So again, this is non-verbal communication, because you haven't even said anything yet, but it's through that interaction, non-verbally, people are getting a sense of you. So if it doesn't go right, or same thing like if we're back in the world where everyone's shaking hands and sometimes people give a handshake and it's kind of weird and your hands don't quite lock properly and you land up like shaking fingers, it's the same kind of thing. You would just say to somebody with a smile, hey, let's do that again properly. And people appreciate that you have not only acknowledged the situation, but the fact that you've taken the time to want to greet them properly. People really appreciate that, and that can create some good rapport right off the bat. So that's, in terms of first impressions, is really good. And then just following what we said about palms up, you would want to do that. But something really interesting can be very helpful when it comes to first impressions. And this is our natural tendency to do what we call mirroring and matching. Now, really, to summarize this could be an entire masterclass on itself. But what happens when you're talking to somebody and you start to minimize differences and you start to maximize similarities is that unconsciously that person starts to feel safer around you. This is great for building rapport. So if you're speaking to somebody and, for example, they're standing in a certain pose, if you started to adopt that same kind of pose, then immediately they may not even realize it, but they start feeling like, hey, we're like each other. And that starts making people feel a lot more comfortable with you, a lot safer with you. If somebody's using a certain gesture when they speak, you could use the same kind of gesture when you speak. You can even mirror things like the way that somebody speaks, like their tonality or their rate of speech or their volume. If somebody speaks very, very quietly and softly, if you match that energy and you start to mirror that, then they feel like you're like them. And so there's lots of different ways that we can do that to be able to start building that rapport. And this goes right down to how we're actually wired as animals, to be able to see animals or other people from afar, and it's our brain trying to forecast by the time we actually approach and are confronted with that person, is that going to be a positive or negative reaction? So our brains in evolutionary terms are already hardwired to be assessing other people's body language to see if it is like ours or if it's threatening. So that's why we can reverse engineer that and do what we call mirroring and matching. The last thing that you want to think of when you're meeting somebody, especially if you're meeting with them in person, is things like eye contact, and specifically around, because I've mentioned before, that you want to look at what is the norm for someone, the norm, N-O-R-M. You know, what is normal for them? So, you know, lastly, if somebody is always, if they're sitting comfortably like this, or if it's cold, or if it's normal for them to do that, or if it's normal for somebody to not hold eye contact with you, what you're really looking for is changes in the norm, changes in their body language. So if you say something to somebody and suddenly they change their body language, they unfold their arms, or they fold their arms, or you say something to them and then they break eye contact, or they create more eye contact, it's the change in their norm that will give you a sense of whether what you're saying is engaging people and what you're doing is actually working to create that connection, or if what you're doing and saying is actually disengaging them. And so you want to be able to look for sets of gestures that come about when we have what we call the stimulus or the trigger, which could just be a sentence that you say or body language that you use. So again, we always want to be looking at the situation, we want to be looking at sets, we want to be looking at harmony of our own body language, being in harmony with what we're saying as well as the other person. And if you use these tips and tricks together with those three fundamentals of SSH, you're definitely going to be able to increase your connection with people, your likability, your rapport, trust, and of course your influence.